All right, welcome everybody. We're going to get started. It is, by my calculations, the 24th of January, or the 25th of January, or the 25th, or the 2017, I think, second session from our class on Pirkei Avot. And as I mentioned before, you can see this on online. A couple of years are on the online resources section of the shul website. So you can watch the last week's class. If you missed it, I gave a little bit of the historical background of Pirkei Avot. What makes this period of Jewish history so fascinating is that it is a time of total transformation and transition, and of course that's where things get interesting. And I traced sort of the history from the destruction of the first temple, which took place in 586 before the Common Era by the Babylonians, subsequently through the restoration. Jewish people were allowed to come back into the land of Israel about 50, 60 years later. We talked about the people who might come. We talked about the fact that they were largely illiterate, and certainly illiterate of the Torah text, and that the great democratization that came from the beginning of reading the Torah in public, in the marketplace on Mondays and Thursdays, as well as on Shabbos morning. If that doesn't sound familiar to you, watch last week's tape, and maybe that'll ring a bell. We towards the end of the class, we talked about the origins of Jewish law that came as a result of the destruction of the temple. Now, prior from the public reading of the Torah, which happened during the time of Ezra, somewhere in the 400s before the Common Era, you go through a period of time when now the Torah is accessible to anybody really who wants to hear it, because it's read in a public place. And what we talked about in some detail last week was the process of interpretation that comes because the Torah itself is deliberately laconic. It gives bits of information, not chronological, sometimes fleshed out in great detail and sometimes not at all. And it was up to individual people, Jewish people, to interpret it. But of course the average person didn't interpret it on their own. They looked for people who were better at it than they, and that's how these schools of interpretation arose. By the time, and by the way, just also, we didn't mention it last week, that those who compiled that oral history, those oral traditions and sort of systematized them, were called the Pharisees, a name which is familiar to many because of the New Testament. The Pharisees were basically proto-rabbis before the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70. They were the ones who believed that there was an oral tradition, that the Torah itself only took you so far, in the kind of the same way as we talked about last week, that the Constitution can only take you so far. The laws need to be applied to different situations, and when they are, case law develops, and over time case law becomes codified. The same thing kind of happens in Jewish law as well. People, eventually they realize cooking a calf in its mother's milk, to use last week's example, does mean any beef cow and any milk, but it doesn't, and it means chicken, but it doesn't mean fish. Somewhere along the line, those things became accepted norms, and the people who promulgated that were known as the Pharisees. There were lots of other sects, subpopulations of Jews who were living by Torah, but the predominant one was the Pharisees. And they are in distinction to the, anybody? Sadducees, to the Sadducees. Sadducees and the Pharisees were the two, and again, the reason we know about this is the New Testament, and also a very famous Jewish, later converted out of Judaism, historian named Josephus, who lived around the time of the destruction of the temple. And you think, well, why isn't there more history about it? I mean, why don't we know? Because when you're involved in it, you don't write history. You know what I mean? The average person who does important stuff doesn't tend to chronicle it. So it's the odd person who writes autobiography, who keeps a diary. I'm always amazed when I read, I love reading biography, and in particular autobiography. I read an autobiography actually over this past weekend of a rabbinic autobiography, and it's amazing to me how people remember anything to write it down. Imagine if you had to write your own history of the past, I don't know, 6 months, let alone what it was like raising your children. You just do it. And so there's not a lot of people writing history, and the fact of the matter is there's not a huge market for it. Wasn't then, and there isn't now. History is not going to be by and large, are not going to be your bestsellers unless you're writing about Hamilton and there happens to be a musical that piques everybody's interest. So that we don't know a whole lot about it, but the two main sources of that time are the New Testament, because Jesus was a Pharisee and grew out of that. And if you think about it, Jesus' way of bringing Jesus was an offshoot of Judaism. I mean, it was basically was one school of interpretation of the oral law. Here's what it says, and here's what I take it to mean. And that's kind of what the rabbis, the Pharisees, were doing as well. His followers took it in a direction that went eventually outside the barriers of what was considered normative Judaism, and then that became the seeds of another religion. But even to this day, you can see the wide disparity of interpretation in Jewish tradition. We think that Reformed conservative, Orthodox Reconstructionist, is a new development because it really only happened, it was only labeled in the mid to late 1800s. But the truth is that Judaism, in the dawn of the rabbinic tradition, was also very, very varied in its interpretation and application. And so the Sadducees were opposed to the oral tradition, and the Pharisees, just to gross oversimplifications here, the Pharisees were temple-based. They were the Kohanim. They're a seat of power. The Sadducees? The Sadducees. That's what I said.
The Sadducees were temple-based?
Yes, the Sadducees were the temple-based
the priests.
Kohanim, and they were opposed to oral tradition because the stricter the adherence to the Torah, for them, because so much of the Torah is based on animal sacrifice, and their whole seat of power was the place where animal sacrifice was being offered. The kind of last thing that they wanted to do was empower anybody to be able to do Judaism wherever you want, in whatever way you want. And that oral tradition was basically that. How do you take this sacred text and use it when you're not in commuting distance from the temple? Living in Egypt, or some Mediterranean area, and so the Sadducees were in direct opposition to the Pharisees, and we know this again because of the Old the New Testament, and also because of Josephus, who writes about it from the Roman perspective, but as a Jew, and he was a chronicler of history, and probably there were others, but because Josephus mentions Jesus, his work becomes the classic, because it's the historical roots of Christianity and the church, which had a tremendous amount of political power and economic power wanted to maintain that, and so that's how we know about sort of this period in history. And so what we were talking about last week is sort of how the Pharisaic side. We'll set the Sadducees aside. And by the way, to cut to the, to let this cat out of the bag, the Sadducees disappear when the temple disappears in 70 because their whole power base is gone. What the raison d'etre is this animal sacrifice and prayer and music and all of the things that are associated with the temple. Once the temple is destroyed in 70, for reasons we're going to talk about in just a bit, their power base is gone, and Pharisaic Judaism wins the day, and the Pharisees become the rabbis. So that's why pre the destruction of the temple, they're not really called rabbis. They're called people like Hillel and Shammai. They're not Rabbi Hillel or Rabbi Shammai, because they're Pharisees, which are an offshoot, but a school of interpretation of Judaism. But they weren't the main authority until the temple's destroyed in 70, and then the Sadducees go away, and the Pharisees have now this unbelievable stroke of luck, although they'll read it back in and say that it was God's destiny for them, where they now have this portable, practical, apply to any kind of situation Judaism that's not anchored to one particular place, which is the Judaism that we live to this very day. Right? You can go around the world and you can practice your Judaism. You can practice your Judaism at home. You can go to synagogues. They're going to be familiar to you. There's no other than the high holidays, there's no cost for entry. When people went to the Sadducees, you had to have a sacrifice. In fact, so much so that outside of the temple, and you can still see the excavations around the old walls of the Temple Mount, there were stalls to sell all the product that you needed to worship. Here, now you don't need that anymore. Now you get a siddur, prayer has replaced sacrifice. You can do that anywhere. You could do it in your, the rabbis also went so far as to say, and you can pray in any language. So you don't need a holy guy to do it. The idea that rabbis were paid professionals is rather new in Jewish tradition. You could just practice your Judaism wherever you were, and Judaism, in essence, out of the ashes of the destruction of the Second Temple, was reborn as this new apply in any situation, practice wherever you go, make of it what you want, kind of tradition that tended to gel around certain schools of interpretation, which we were talking about last time. But we're not. But after the destruction of the temple, we're still not codified. You had lots of different Jews doing Judaism in different ways, and even their leading authorities had different interpretations. And so, like we're going to talk about, like people like Rabbi Ishmael and Rabbi Akiba, who are now rabbis because it's post 70 and the temple's destroyed, become leading promulgators of this law. But there's always this symbiotic relationship between what they're teaching and what people are doing.
Question?
Yeah.
If it had been reversed and the Sadducees had lived on, would there be Christianity?
That was my question. I was wondering that as well.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Great conversation.
Yes. The short answer is yes in some form, and it might not necessarily have become its own religion. Maybe I don't know, but I'll tell you the reason why something like that had to happen is because Jewish law is so rigorous. It's hard to be an observant Jew. And what Christianity basically did was make Judaism a whole lot easier in terms of ritual practice. So you don't have to keep kosher. You don't have to observe the laws of family purity. You don't, the list goes on and on. And the truth is that Judaism evolved in that way as well. So I think it accelerated the process.
But if there was no Jesus, who knows what it would have been?
No. Jesus was the yeast in the dough. He wasn't the dough. The dough was all of his, all of the schools. And if you think about it, it's exactly what we were talking about last week with Bernie and Steve and all of
Right.
them. Jesus was a Bernie, and enough people came to him, but it wasn't until Saul of Tarsus, who later became Paul, took his message and did an Ezra on it by carrying it around to everybody else, and then all these schools of thought came around, which itself, by the way, not particularly germane to this class, but maybe it is, became church canon. So they also had these oral traditions and wrote them down, which became church canon, which became, they thought was going to be universal. That's why they called it Catholic, because it applied to everybody. But it didn't, because it was too rigorous in terms of its ritual demands. And then another, so the fact that Reform or conservative Judaism comes as an easier expression than the rigors of strict adherence to Jewish law is the natural flow of humanity. That is I don't know what Hinduism is like in India, but my guess is there are frum Hindus, and they're a much smaller group than the less frum Hindus, and probably those less frum Hindus organized, right? And maybe they have the Reform Hindu college, in Bengali or something,
So in the book that I'm reading, and it's hard for me to separate fact from fiction, so is Shaul HaTarsis, who became Paul, Saul, was he Rabbi Eliezer's uncle?
I don't know that. I don't know the answer to that.
Dying to find that. And also, the word in Hebrew for Pharisees is Prushim.
Right.
So where does that come from? Lifrosh min hatzibur or lefaresh?
No, like
Perush, to give commentary.
Again, I honestly, off the top of my head, I always thought it came from something implying sectarian, but I guess it probably makes more sense to be Perush as in to pull meaning out of the text, but honestly I don't know the derivation off the top of my head. What is clear about this time is that something that looked absolutely 100% catastrophic for the Jews turned out to be probably the best thing that ever happened. So, in other words, imagine if if God's connection to earth comes through this mystical column of smoke that goes up from the Temple Mount and connects heaven and earth. And by the way, the tradition goes back and reads that that's Mount Moriah, where Abraham almost sacrificed Isaac, and they go back further, maybe Adam and Eve, which could never have lived there, But this was the center, the connection between God and Jews, and it is totally obliterated. So that you can't imagine anything more catastrophic. But the seeds for the rebirth were already planted in the Pharisees, who had already been talking about this oral interpretation that didn't need that. And now this was carte blanche for the Pharisees, because that source of that power base for the Sadducees, their principal opposition, disappeared. And then it wasn't too long before the Pharisees, now come rabbis post 70, as one can well imagine, start consolidating their power. There's a political side to this as well, and that's in part why Christianity became threatening to them. But there was probably also other expressions of Judaism that were, if not equally, certainly as threatening as well. If anybody's ever been, for instance, to Qumran, the Dead Sea community that's been recently excavated. If you go to Israel and you are down near the Dead Sea sect were called the Essenes in the New Testament, but they were another branch of Judaism that practiced this very high degree of asceticism, and there were probably dozens and dozens and dozens of them. But the Pharisees, because of the power we talked about last week, with all the people coming to them for interpretation, and the people who were most authoritative winning out, and the ones who didn't really have a lot of students became plumbers and doctors and lawyers or whatever it was in the ancient world that they wanted to do besides being professional Torah interpreters. And so that they solidified their power in starting in 70. And so, and we've never really looked back since. So that we, even to this day, we Jews, I mean, there might be Orthodox people, there's always going to be people on the fringes of the spectrum. But the main part of the spectrum, we give lip service to restoring the temple. We don't really want the temple, and it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, even if the Dome of the Rock wasn't there, right? You know, which would, you know. And by the way, in great history, Simon Sebag wrote this, the biography of Jerusalem a couple of years ago. It's a huge book, but it's really very, very interesting. And even as recently as the 1980s, the Israeli police were stopped right as it was about to go, a plot to blow up the Dome of the Rock and rebuild the temple. So as to be able to rebuild the temple. We don't want that. We don't want that. Not only do we not want World War III with the Muslims, but set all of that aside, the fact of the matter is that diaspora Judaism has survived because we don't have a temple. Because if we had to make that, and every other religion has realized that too. People, you know, Islam, you're supposed to make the Hajj, you're supposed to go to Mecca, you're supposed to do the journey from Mecca to Medina and all that. Most people don't do that because they realize you got to have a portable religion. And so the destruction of the temple actually allowed us to be able to create that. And so it's in that historical milieu, and it was destroyed, by the way, by the Romans. Also something very interesting to understand in terms of the mentality, especially the mission that we are, I promise, going to look at today, is that the first temple was destroyed, as I talked about last week, because the Babylonians just were consolidating power by destroying everybody's confidence in their own gods. So I talked about last week, the Babylonians, when they would get into a community, they would collect all the household gods and put them in a storehouse or destroy them. And they couldn't collect our God because he's invisible, so they just destroyed his house. You know, and that, you know, to break the will of the of the Jewish people. The second temple was destroyed, however. So there really wasn't anti-Semitism. The Babylonians were not necessarily anti-Semitic any more than they were anti any of the other religions around them. They're just consolidating their power by undermining the faith of the people that they were trying to subjugate. Not the case with the Romans. The Romans were anti-Semitic. The Romans had it in for Judaism. They wanted to, they specifically targeted Judaism as a religion, and it was destroyed for religious, as even more so than political reasons. And the reason that we know that is that a system was put into place to make sure that rabbinic Judaism wouldn't flourish. So if they were only concerned with destroying the Sadducees, you know, and making a symbol of that, they would have left Judaism alone. But they deliberately targeted anybody who was teaching Judaism in subsequent generations. Parenthetically, though, also interesting if you're reading history of this particular time period, not universally. The Roman emperors post 70 were by and large really bad for the Jews, but every once in a while there was some that were good. And some of them reigned only for 1 or 2 years, and some of them reigned for 10 years. And it was an off and on relationship between the Jewish people and what should have been their absolute arch enemies, the people who destroyed the temple of the Romans. It's not quite that way, because, and this gets to the heart of also of this Mishnah. Jews have never, except for in the biblical period, put any real emphasis, and except since post 1948, I suppose, in being militaristic. It's not a thing. There's not a tractate of Talmud on how to conduct war. I mean, there are commandments. Don't take advantage of the enemy. Treat them fairly. You know, give them warning. Right, all of this kind of stuff. Not about how to win a war. Right. Not about how, you know, tactics for war.
Make sure you're really fair and
right, exactly. We and from our earliest time, and this is really something that we Jews need to own, even in the age of Israel, being the strongest fighting force in the Middle East. by necessity, of course. Jewish people, we Jewish people have created the world of the mind, which transcends the political realities wherever we find ourselves in, and we're very, very good at working with whoever's in charge, including back to the time of the Romans. So it's actually, and I was talking about this a little bit last week, it's because Jews got along so well with the Romans that Yehuda HaNasi, Judah the Prince, was able to codify the Mishnah because he had such good relations. In fact, it's very interesting in a it's not often highlighted part of Jewish history. A lot of these rabbis who ultimately died as martyrs, we read the martyrology if you're still in shul on Yom Kippur at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. We read these absolutely horrible stories to ourselves because if we read them in public, we would throw up because they're just so graphically disgusting about what they did, what the Romans did in terms of torture. I mean, you can't, in your wildest imagination, you couldn't come up with the barbarity that your kids can read in the Machzor on Yom Kippur, that we still hold these martyrs in such high esteem that thousands of years later we still read their stories. But a lot of these rabbis who were martyred were frequent visitors to Rome. They actually served as emissaries of the Jewish community in negotiating and speaking with Rome. And it was really when things turned sour, because some of the Roman leaders were great and some of them were horribly anti-Semitic. It was when Hadrian, the most anti-Semitic of them all, really put down the Bar Kokhba rebellion, which we'll talk about another time, that we get that idea that the Jews were just universally oppressed by the Romans. There was a lot of interchange between the Jewish world and the Roman world. It's not that long a boat ride. If you go to Israel, if you ever go on, especially if you ever visited Israel, which is popular now. It wasn't when I was growing up, but it's a thing now. Cruising, you can cruise the Greek islands, and then you can go to Israel. It's a thing. A lot of people who have been to Israel for the first time do it as an excursion, for a 2-day excursion from Viking cruises. Yeah, it's a, yeah.
So where are they going to Haifa?
Yeah, they pull into Haifa. In fact, I just was with a family who just was there from. They did a cruise and they were in Jerusalem for the first time. It was an overnight. So the point is, it's not that far away, and there was a lot of communication between the two, and so it's in this time, this sort of transition time. Temples destroyed, portable Judaism, subject to interpretation, has now become the norm. That Jewish law begins to evolve, and I want to just clarify something that I said last week, which will put a little bit more flesh on the bones. I had talked about the way that the Mishnah, as the code of Jewish law, was written. You'll remember Yehuda HaNasi, all the things that were passed over here, and all the things are big pile, small pile, small pile. That's only partially true. It's a gross oversimplification. There were people who were doing it first, who were codifying Jewish law. Because you can understand where they came from what we talked about last week. Eventually, Barry, the interpreter, got the school of Barry, and eventually the people who knew the Torah of Barry after a couple of generations were probably already organizing these things topically. And what Yehuda HaNasi did was he didn't have to go to every single Jew in the world or even every single city. He went to the people like Rabbi Akiba and Rabbi Ishmael, who we're going to read about in just a moment, and said, what do you guys think? What's your school of thought on this? And that became codified in the first code of Jewish law called the Mishnah. And a lot of those guys' ethical teachings that are not related to Jewish law were collected in Pirkei Avot. And that's where Pirkei Avot comes from. It's non-halachic, non-Jewish law, stories, moral lessons of that time. And the last point I want to say before we open up the text is understand that it is deliberately not halachic. So to say Pirkei Avot says, therefore Jewish people should do, it's not the same as the Torah says don't eat a pig, therefore Jews don't eat a pig. Right? These are ethical teachings that are specific, that are designed to engender conversation and thought. And I emphasize this in part because the Mishnah that we're about to read, chapter 3, Mishnah number 12, is particularly open to wide interpretation, and you could take it two totally diametrically opposed different ways. So let's take a look. The Mishnah, the way Mishnayot in general are organized. I'm on page now 46 in the text. And also for those of you who have not been studying in the past or just need a reminder, we're on, you'll see on the left-hand side it says 3:15. On side 46 at the top, sort of top 20, page 46. Oh, I'm sorry, you're right, 3:12. Sorry. Yep, thank you. Page 44 on the top left-hand side, it says 3:12. On page 44, thanks, Robinson. That means it's chapter 3 of the Mishnah Avot, the 12th Mishnah. Okay? Each one of these teachings is numbered. But the numbering, although the chapters are universal, the numbering is not. So that if you Google Pirkei Avot 3:12, you'll find a bunch of different, some will have 3:9 will actually be 3:12, what we read is 3:12, and some will have 3:16. Because the way the Mishnahs are chopped up is different in different versions of Pirkei Avot. Here it's Mishnah number 3, chapter number 3, Mishnah number 12. Okay, so I'm going to just read it quickly, and then we're going to start to dissect it. It's a very pithy kind of short, simple statement. Rabbi Ishmael would say, "Be speedy to obey a superior, be dignified before the young, and cheerfully greet every person." Okay, well, three simple things: be speedy to obey somebody of higher rank who tells you what to do. Be dignified, because simple reading, be a role model for the young, and cheerfully greet every person. Now, obviously, there are going to be many ways of reading this text, and I'm going to start with one that you would have no access to at all, which may actually be the real motivation for this teaching. So, as I mentioned, the temple was destroyed. Rabbinic Judaism takes off in a community called Yavne, which we're not going to get into, or we'll never study this Mishnah. But Yavne becomes headed by a guy named Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who was smuggled out of Jerusalem, starts the first yeshiva, first Jewish learning academy in a community that's obviously walking distance from Jerusalem, called Yavne, and it becomes the seat of the Sanhedrin, which was the Jewish court of law that had prior to that existed on the Temple Mount. If you've ever been to Jerusalem, how many of you have been to? So pretty much everybody here. So if when you go to the southern steps, you walked up those southern steps, and you'll notice at the top of the southern steps, there's two arches that are totally bricked in now. Not if you know what I'm talking about. No.
Yeah.
So if you go, you're looking at the Kotel. You'll follow the wall down, and then around to the right. That's the southern wall. This is the western wall, the southern wall. There's steps there. It's called the Davidson Archaeological Digs. You can walk up those steps, and then at the top of the steps, where you would go through the wall, where there would be a gateway. There's two gateways, and they're totally bricked in. Now you can't do that. If you could before, you would walk through a very dark corridor. You were a pilgrim there prior to 70. You would walk through a dark corridor, and as you came out, you would see on your right-hand side where the 70 elders of the Jewish people, the leaders, the chief justices, so to speak, the Sanhedrin, sat in a building, and in front of you, you would see the temple. And of course, you're coming out. They were brilliant in terms of the architecture. They really knew how to do it right. You come through this dark hall, and you come and you see this magnificent marble and stone, white stone, Jerusalem stone structure, with its blinding to the eyes, in the Middle Eastern sun, on the top of a high hill or small mountain, and the Sanhedrin sat there. And so it was very, very important to start over the Sanhedrin once the temple was destroyed, because now with the Pharisees come rabbis sitting in justice there. That's how you move Judaism forward, is you have to have some sort of central authority. And so they reestablished the central authority, and during Rabbi Ishmael's time, there was a guy named Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, who was the head of the Sanhedrin. He was the chief justice. Unfortunately, he just had a bad attitude. He was just not a sweetheart. He was not a sweet guy. In fact, he was such at times, a tyrant. I mean, he was just, belittle students, make people feel bad about their opinions, and then finally they say, "We can't deal with you anymore. You're deposed. You're out." So they couldn't. So right, change your power, right? So change your power. So they brought in a young rabbi, 18 years old, named Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, who took over for Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. And he's the one, who in the beginning of the Haggadah, I'm like 70 years old, and you might remember the story. His hair turned from black to white, so people would take him seriously. It was a miracle. I think it was just stress, but in any case, he becomes the leader, and amongst the famous rabbis who are witness to this is Rabbi Ishmael, who is a contemporary of Rabbi Akiba's, which we can talk about at some. A bit later. He might just simply be saying, "Be speedy to obey a superior. We've just elected this young guy, but if you don't respect the office, the whole system is going to fall apart. Be dignified before the young." Elazar ben Azariah is very young. Great, is very young, and this is an old. A seasoned rabbi saying, "Listen to this guy," in a veiled sort of way, and cheerfully greet every person. So that may well be the historical precedent for this, and it certainly is that time period. Before we get into it, because I don't want to have to carry these Sidurim one more time to this class, this Rabbi Ishmael. Is so important in Jewish life that we actually read about him every single day of the year as part of our liturgy. And just very briefly, if you could open up, we'll share. Yeah, I didn't bring a ton of them, but if you look on page 12, in the weekday Siddur, and this is in every weekday Siddur, it says, Rabbi Ishmael, these are the 13 principles of elucidating the Torah from Rabbi Ishmael. This is the same Rabbi Ishmael we're reading about now, the same Rabbi Ishmael who probably said, listen to Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. An inference can be drawn from one premise to another that is more inclusive or another that is less inclusive. It's legalese. But the basics for this was his method for teasing out meaning from the Torah itself, for example. Number 3, a comprehensive principle may be derived from a single text or two related texts. You can understand he's taking different pieces of the Torah, matching them up, saying, logically, if we connect this and this, we can draw this inference, and you create a legal system based on putting them together. And Rabbi Ishmael, in particular, was very famous, and why he's probably still read to this day, because he said the Torah is written in the language of human beings, Bilshon B'nai Adam, and therefore it's our duty to interpret it in a logical, practical, applicable to everyday life kind of way, as opposed to his study partner, sometimes rival, Rabbi Akiba, who said everything is mystical, and you need, there's even the little crowns on the top of the Torah will teach you an area of law. And crowns on the top of the Torah tell people how to do Judaism. Okay, let's just get this thing across so that people can understand how to practice it. And that's why he put these principles out. And that's why to this day we read these principles as if to say to you, Joe and Jane Jew, you can read these principles and understand how Torah came to be. You don't need to be a rabbi. You don't need to be a Kohen. You don't need to have...
Every day you read them?
Every single day we read these. Now, quite frankly, I will tell you, at best we skim them. Because it's like at every day saying we're going to read the Constitution, or every day we're going to read the Declaration of Independence, or more the Constitution, because this is really legalese. But it's embedded there as a reminder that the democratization of Judaism that took place at that time when the temple was first destroyed allowed you and me and anybody else who opens up the book to interpret Torah.
This is fascinating.
Yeah, it's really, and we read it every single day. Shabbos, weekdays, Yom Kippur, every morning. It's read quietly to yourself, and then it's followed by the Kaddish de Rabbanan, a special Kaddish for studying Torah. And there's some sections of Torah that always appear before it. Each editor of a Siddur kind of picks what they want. The conservative movement picked its own. But this is the same Rabbi Ishmael that we're reading about here. And also just a little biographical vignette. The story in the Talmud tells of Rabbi Ishmael is he was really, really handsome, like super good looking, and he was taken captive in some way by the Romans. And one of these missions to Rome that the rabbis were on, that I was talking about before, when communication was open between them and the Romans, one of the famous rabbis was walking down the street and he heard somebody quoting the Bible, and he realized that he said the next part, the next guy said the other person said the next part of the verse to him, and he realized, oh my God, this is a Jewish guy who's being held captive here, and he raised money and he ransomed Rabbi Ishmael, and Rabbi Ishmael came back and started teaching Torah in Israel. This is all the story of Rabbi Ishmael, which, if you think about it, helps to make sense. Be speedy to obey a superior. He grew up, it's not quite so far-fetched. I love Joseph Talishkin always says far-fetched sounds like a Yiddish expression. It's so far-fetched. Yeah. So it's not that far-fetched to assume that this Rabbi Ishmael knew what he was talking about in terms of be speedy to obey a superior. So what do you think when you hear be speedy to obey a superior? How does that strike you today? And before you respond, I just want to. It's so important to be able to know a little bit about the Hebrew here. So I'm going to just share with you the expression. The expression in English is "be speedy to obey a superior." That's a translation. Every translation, every translation is a commentary. No two languages, word for word, mean the same thing. Impossible. They're a reflection of their milieu. It's kal larosh. That's what he means. All he says is, Rabbi Ishmael Omer says, have be kal larosh. The word kal means easy, simple, and rosh is head. Exactly, head. Right. So it says, be kal larosh.
Easy head.
Yeah, be easy of head. Right, be easy head. Right. So now you can see, be speedy to obey a superior. He might mean rosh, as in today we call the head of the government rosh memshalah, the head of the government.
Or rosh yeshiva.
Or rosh yeshiva. Exactly. So maybe he was using rosh in that way. But the word kal also easy. So, easy and speedy are not the same thing.
No.
Right.
So, if you were writing a translation and it was saying, assuming Rosh means somebody of superior social political status.
In charge.
Yeah, in charge. What would you translate Kal as? What would your advice be here in your own translation? What do you think this means?
Don't give the new head guy a hard time.
Right, don't give any head guy a hard time. Right, probably not going to be good for you. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and not good for the system, by the way. But yeah, what else? Anybody else?
If you listen to the rosh, it's going to be easy for you.
Right. Sometimes, right. You have to listen to the rosh. You have to obey. You have to be willing to obey.
Does it also mean use your head?
Right. Maybe it means
Use your head. Don't be an idiot. Use your head.
So how do you fit Kal into that interpretation?
It's simple. Use your head.
It's simple. Use your head.
What's Kyle again? Kyle is
Easy. Yeah, call, like, right. Today, call would be simple, or it could also,
Oh, yeah. Go ahead.
yeah,
Isn't it just easier to get along and go with whatever your superior is saying?
right. It's easier to go with the flow. And by the way, I don't think, just to jump ahead, I don't think that he's talking about despots. I think he's talking about people of authority. It doesn't necessarily, just because a person has authority, doesn't mean that they categorically need to be listened to. But by and large, it is better. I would translate,
Easy on your own head.
yeah, I would say if LaRoche is authority, I would say be yielding to authority. Kal is like, Kal is easy as opposed to stubborn. Pliable versus, intransigent. Cooperative, yeah. Kal, make things in particular go easy, easy. And I think part of this advice is necessary. The way I read this is, in part, is be yielding to all of us want to be in charge of our own lives. Some people are better at accepting direction than others, but most people, I don't know, maybe I'm only speaking for myself, I'd rather give direction to me than have somebody else tell me what to do. On the other hand, if there is no system of authority, it's total chaos and anarchy, right? So that, as any classroom teacher will tell you, if you don't have control of your classroom, your students can't learn. And if there's no authority in that situation, nobody knows where they fit into the system. So one of the things that he is saying, even if we're talking about Elazar ben Azariah, is be yielding to authority, A, because it will make things go easier for you, and B, because you'll now have a system of which you're a part and knowing where you fit in the system, but also you won't be so full of your own ego that you're not willing to learn.
So be in control of your life within the system.
Be in control of your life within the system, but be willing to understand that taking direction is not a sign of weakness.
Right.
That's, to me, the most important thing. Because I think that people think that if you're told what to do, you are surrendering your own autonomy, which is the opposite of what true learning is really all about. If you start with the supposition that intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually you are an independent being and no one can change your soul, you are who you are, then you can be open to all different kinds of learning, all different kinds of opinions that come at you, and decide how to integrate them into your lives, into your individual life. And sometimes it will mean going one way on the outside, but recognizing who you are on the inside. But if you start from a position of ego, where you are set in your ways, then how are you possibly going to learn? Think about I would say the majority, a significant portion of the most important life lessons I have learned kicking and screaming. I don't know if that's true for you, but most of the most important things I learned the hard way. And those
Sticks with you.
and that's exactly, and that's what sticks with you. So Kal LaRoche, I take to be easy of mind. In other words, don't be so uptight that if somebody contradicts you or somebody suggests a better way to do something or a totally different way of interpreting it, you're going to be so set in your ways that you wouldn't entertain that idea. And I need not tell you, but that is the most important piece of advice we have for our political climate today. I mean, in a horribly polarized society, what Rabbi Ishmael is saying is probably the most important thing. Be Kal LaRoche. Yielding to authority doesn't mean accepting any authority. It means being open to that you might be wrong about somebody, and someone who you think is wrong might be right, at least in some aspect.
Oh, my.
But that is the basis of civil society. And I think as Rabbi Ishmael is trying to promulgate it, he's saying on one hand, yes, you need authority, because if you don't buy into authority, the whole system falls down. But at the same time, recognize that authority teaching you isn't a threat to your own autonomy. It's a way of you expanding your understanding and nuance of the world around you. And I think that that's a fantastic piece of advice that somebody who lived in the Roman world and the Jewish world could understand, and really is a function of his own life experience. Comments, Robinson?
It says in here in the commentary also that Yishmael's advice is that one should be swift to obey God in one's youth, so that such obedience will be easy in one's old age. Right,
It
goes into the next little part.
Yeah. There's actually, we're going to talk about it next time. There's actually two ways of reading this. Whether
the hair is dark.
Yeah, right. I honestly, I don't think that's the way Rashi reads it too. I honestly think that it means that be speedy to obey a superior means at every stage of your life recognize that you can always learn from other people, but be dignified before the young means is the flip side of it. When you have the power, this is how you deal with somebody of superior power. Now that you've got the superior power, what do you do with it? That's the second half of this mission. And then that be happy, greet everyone with a cheerful expression is sort of the way of tying the whole thing together. But I just to reiterate, and we're going to get to the second half of the Mishnah. What I think the Rabbi Ishmael is asserting is both the importance of authority and the autonomy of the individual, which I think is again something you couldn't have a more appropriate message for today.
Yeah.
That if there isn't trust in the government, if there isn't trust that there is a sense of order and a set rule of logic of governance that you can rely on, the system falls apart. But if you believe that your sole duty is to obey blindly, then the system also doesn't function as well. And that was the system, and that understanding was exactly what made Rabbinic Judaism so dynamic. It was the ability to say, okay, there are authorities, but we do it this way. And what do you make of that? And remember that we talked about last week, where they would say, well, my wife does it that way, and my husband does it this way. And it's not about coming and saying, you're going to do it this way. There's going to become a system that says, yes, there's authority, but some people do it this way, and some people do it this way. And we discuss, and we go back and forth. And to this day, if you go to a yeshiva where Jewish law is studied, it is loud, because there are students sitting on either side of a desk debating back and forth. And yet there are traditions that they can go to and say, this is what it has been taken to mean over time. And that ability for us, and I mean the people around this table, to be able to contribute to that discussion and say, based on my life experience and my dedication to Judaism and my willingness to say that Judaism is an authority in my life, nonetheless, I believe that this is what Judaism should be saying, and that's what's always moved Judaism forward. I'm sitting in a room, mostly Martin and Marvin were the sole exceptions here, of women. If that conversation hadn't been pushed forward by people who said times change and Judaism needs to adapt to changing situations, none of you would have had the egalitarian rights that you take for granted. That's what he's talking about here, is that it requires an ability to integrate with the world around you, to not be so defensive as to say it can only be one way, and yet at the same time recognize that there is authority. to me, that is a powerful and profound message, both politically and personally, as well. Nobody wants to be that parent who only says, you're doing it this way because I say so. There are moments when you need to say, don't touch that oven, it's hot, because I say so. And then there are moments to say, you know what, I didn't really think of it that way. I didn't really look at it that way. I never really thought about it that way. And the thing that I'm going to close with here is a piece of counseling advice that I give all the time, for particularly in couples counseling. And that is that when you get into a heated situation with somebody you love and you have a disagreement, what Rabbi Ishmael, to my mind, is teaching is that instead of fighting fire with fire and escalating, a much more sensible thing, if you have it in your file cabinet of thoughtful responses, I never really thought about it that way. Give me some time to think. It validates the other person. You're not agreeing with them. You're not disagreeing with them. You're saying, I'm willing to entertain another way of looking at this because I care about you, about us, about this issue. You know, I never really thought about it that way. Give me some time to think. But I just need some time. And I think that that's what he's saying. There's authority, and yet validates the input of the individual, which I think has made rabbinic Judaism as dynamic as it is today, because it reflects our uniquely, or certainly our special way of looking at the world as Jews. So that's it for today. We'll come back for more.
Thank you.
Martin, could you hit the red button for me, please?